I was sitting on the porch, the wooden slats warm beneath my hands. The doorbell camera flickered to life, a blue light illuminating the screen as I scrolled through the footage from earlier in the day. The familiar sound of kids laughing filled the air, but suddenly it shattered like glass when I saw him. The homeless man, a figure I'd seen around town too many times to count. He was being shoved against the ground by two officers, their batons drawn like swords in an ancient battle. I felt a wave of heat wash over me. It wasn't just anger, but fear swelling in my chest. The children were inside, blissfully unaware of this raw display of power just steps away from their safe haven. I rushed inside, my heart pounding as I called for Kate. "You need to see this," I said, urgency threading through my voice. She met me at the door, her brow furrowed with concern as she leaned closer to watch the screen. "What are they doing?" she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "They're supposed to protect us," I replied, feeling that sense of betrayal curl tightly in my gut. My fingers grazed over the camera's lens while I replayed the moment in disbelief. Just then, Evan burst through the door with a skateboard tucked under one arm. His eyes darted between us and the screen. "What's going on?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tremor within me. "There's been an incident outside." A heaviness settled over us as we all watched, breaths caught in our throats like fish flopping out of water. "It's not right," Kate finally said, breaking the silence that had wrapped itself around us like fog. Her decision struck me like a lightning bolt. She didn't want this injustice to go unnoticed. "What if we report them? What if we sue?" Her words fell into the room with a weight that demanded attention. The tension shifted. It was no longer about what had happened outside, but now about how we would respond to it together as a family. A rush of adrenaline surged through me at that thought. Fighting back against such blatant cruelty felt necessary. But even as hope flickered within me at Kate's suggestion, doubt crept in too. What would it mean for us? Would we become targets ourselves? Would this only escalate things with law enforcement? "Maybe we should think this through," I uttered hesitantly, each word deliberate and heavy with unspoken fears. But something nagged at my conscience. Could silence still be an option after witnessing such brutality? Before anyone could respond further, Sam walked in from outside, shaking his head as he joined our small circle. "Did you see what happened? That was insane!" His youthful energy clashed sharply against our solemn atmosphere. The differences between us collided with every heartbeat. How could he so easily dismiss it while our hearts were still heavy? "We're thinking about taking action," I said firmly, looking directly at Sam with expectation mixed with apprehension. "I'm all in," he shot back without a second thought. I glanced around at everyone's expressions. Determination, mingled with uncertainty, hung thick in the air between us like smoke from an extinguished flame. As I returned my gaze to that doorbell camera footage playing silently before us again, an unsettling realization dawned upon me. Once we decided to act against police misconduct, here and now, there would be no turning back. Not for any of us. And yet, what truly lay ahead remained shrouded in ambiguity, like shadows dancing just beyond reach on a sunlit path leading into darkness. The sound of the wind rustled through the trees, a gentle whisper underlining the tension that brewed on our porch. I had gathered my family, a mix of nervous glances and absent-minded fiddling with their phones. The HOA letters lay scattered on the table, stark reminders of our shared obligation and the fractures running through our household. "Can we talk about last Sunday?" I said, my voice steady but urgent. The memory of that homeless man being dragged away by the police played in my mind like an old film reel. It was hard to shake off the image of his frightened eyes, especially knowing our kids had witnessed it all. Kate looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed. "What's there to discuss? It's not like we can change what happened." Her words hung heavy in the air, igniting a familiar friction between us. I could sense Daniel shifting uncomfortably beside her. He always did when emotions ran high. "Maybe we can't change the past," I replied, leaning forward, hands clasped together as if praying for understanding. "But we can decide how we respond moving forward. My heart raced at the thought of confronting not just the police, but also my own family about this. Sam finally broke his silence, rubbing at his temples as if trying to ease a headache brought on by our collective anxiety. "Dad, are you really considering suing? What good will that do?" His skepticism felt like ice water splashed onto my determination. "I'm not just thinking about justice for him," I said carefully, choosing each word like a lawyer crafting a case. "I'm thinking about our kids. They saw something that shouldn't happen in front of anyone, especially not children." Evan shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. He'd always been sensitive to issues of right and wrong, perhaps too sensitive at times. "But is it worth it? The backlash? You know how people talk." I sighed deeply. Every heartbeat felt like a drum echoing against the wooden porch beneath us. "I understand your concerns," I said, keeping my tone firm yet calm. "But what message do we send if we stay silent?" Just then, Megan entered with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a curious look on her face. The weight of unspoken words shifted in an instant as she waited for someone to speak first. "What's going on?" she asked innocently, plopping down beside Sam. Her presence seemed to dissolve some tension, but also created new questions. Would she feel safe growing up here now? Would any child? The thought sliced through me like a knife through flesh. I couldn't allow this incident to define their childhood. Kate looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed. "What's there to discuss? It's not like we can change what happened." Her words hung heavy in the air again, igniting a familiar friction between us. I could sense Daniel shifting uncomfortably beside her. He always did when emotions ran high. "Maybe we can't change the past," I replied, leaning forward, hands clasped together as if praying for understanding. "But we can decide how we respond moving forward." My heart raced at the thought of confronting not just the police, but also my own family about this. Sam finally broke his silence, rubbing at his temples as if trying to ease a headache brought on by our collective anxiety. "Dad, are you really considering suing? What good will that do?" His skepticism felt like ice water splashed onto my determination. "I'm not just thinking about justice for him," I said carefully, choosing each word like a lawyer crafting a case. "I'm thinking about our kids. They saw something that shouldn't happen in front of anyone, especially not children." Evan shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. He'd always been sensitive to issues of right and wrong, perhaps too sensitive at times. "But is it worth it? The backlash? You know how people talk." I sighed deeply. Every heartbeat felt like a drum echoing against the wooden porch beneath us. "I understand your concerns," I said, keeping my tone firm, yet calm. "But what message do we send if we stay silent?" Just then, Megan entered with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a curious look on her face. The weight of unspoken words shifted in an instant as she waited for someone to speak first. "What's going on?" she asked innocently, plopping down beside Sam. Her presence seemed to dissolve some tension, but also created new questions. Would she feel safe growing up here now? Would any child? The thought sliced through me like a knife through flesh. I couldn't allow this incident to define their childhood. Kate interjected before I could answer. "We're discussing whether or not Dad should take action after what happened last weekend." Megan frowned slightly but tilted her head knowingly, as if she grasped more than her age suggested. "You mean because they hurt that man?" Silence fell again, as everyone grappled with their thoughts and feelings, laid bare before us like raw nerve endings exposed to light. "I think he should," Evan finally spoke up, his voice tinged with newfound resolve. "If no one stands up for him, then who will?" In that moment, something shifted within me, a flicker of hope ignited by my son's unexpected affirmation. Perhaps I wasn't alone in this fight after all. "Okay," I said slowly, absorbing Evan's conviction while letting it seep into me like warm sunlight breaking through clouds after rain. "If we decide to go ahead with this, we need to be united." Kate rolled her eyes slightly but didn't protest aloud again. Instead, she bit her lip thoughtfully while glancing at Sam as if gauging his response. "Let's set aside the HOA letters for now," I suggested gently but firmly,
an umbrella meant to shield us from storms better left outside for another day. This is bigger than those trivial matters. A palpable shift settled over us. Suddenly discussing neighborhood rules felt overshadowed by larger social implications, and somehow more pressing too. Yet lingering questions persisted. How would other neighbors react? Would they support us or vilify us for challenging authority? As we sat there together on that porch, the cool breeze fluttering around us, I felt both emboldened and vulnerable under scrutiny from those closest to me. Every creak of wood beneath our feet echoed possibilities yet unseen ahead. "It's going to be tough," I whispered into the twilight air that began to wrap around us like an embrace full of warmth despite lingering uncertainty. Megan nodded solemnly as though accepting responsibility herself, while Evan leaned forward with eagerness shining in his eyes, ready for action beyond mere discussion. But my mind nagged with doubt. Was this truly the right path? What would happen next? In that moment, the weighty question loomed large above us, like an unfinished letter waiting for its final signature before being sent out into uncertain territory, where consequences awaited. The door opened and here stood Helen, her face pale but resolute. She glanced at the stack of legal documents in my hands, a damning collection that could either save us or bury us deeper in this fight. I could see the uncertainty flickering in her eyes like a candle in a storm. She had always been the anchor in my tumultuous life, but now she was caught between fear and resolute. "What if we don't get the support we need, Bob?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Before I could respond, an unexpected figure stepped into the room. Marcus, our youngest son. He held a tattered cardboard box filled with old photographs and memories from our past. His innocent presence cut through the tension like a knife, reminding us of what was at stake. Our family's legacy. "Our history matters," Marcus said earnestly, pulling out a photo of me standing next to Martin Luther King. It felt like a weighty reminder of our shared struggles and victories. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about teaching my children to stand tall against injustice. Helen inhaled sharply as she took in our son's words. "You're right," she said slowly, her determination rekindling. "We can't let fear dictate our actions." The shift in her demeanor was palpable. I saw a fire ignite within her that had dimmed under the weight of our challenges. Suddenly the atmosphere became electric with possibility. Helen reached for the case files on the table and began sorting through them methodically. The papers rustled like leaves caught in a gust of wind, each one holding secrets and potential paths to justice. "Let's lay everything out," she urged, her fingers deftly organizing evidence and testimonies. "The truth is on our side." Her voice gained strength as she spoke. It was as if she were conjuring up allies from thin air. As we worked together under the soft glow of the desk lamp, I felt something shift between us, a united front forged in passion and purpose. The journey ahead still loomed large, but now we were armed with renewed courage. Just then, the phone rang abruptly, shattering our focused silence. My heart raced as I snatched it up. It could be news we desperately needed or another burden weighing us down even further. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. A familiar voice crackled through the line. It was Charles from the local news station. "Bob, we're doing a segment on your case tomorrow night." His enthusiasm flooded through me like cold water on a hot day. "We want to highlight how important this struggle is for everyone." I exchanged glances with Helen and Marcus. Their expressions danced between hope and apprehension. This could bring public attention to our plight, or invite more scrutiny than we bargained for. "We'll be ready," I replied firmly, though an uneasy feeling twisted in my stomach like ice around my heart. After hanging up, I turned back to them, my family, the ones who mattered most. "We have to prepare ourselves," Helen declared with newfound certainty. "If they're putting us on air, we need to present ourselves strong." There was an edge of excitement mixed with anxiety coursing through me as I nodded in agreement. But as much as I wanted to embrace this opportunity for exposure, doubts crept into my mind, like shadows at dusk. What if they twisted our story? What if they misrepresented our motives? The stakes were higher than—
The sound of the Mont Blanc pen tapping rhythmically against the table was like a clock counting down to a moment I wasn't sure I wanted.
Each tap echoed in the quiet of my porch, reminding me that decisions loomed large and heavy. The kids were inside, their laughter now a distant memory, replaced by shadows that haunted their young minds after what they'd witnessed last weekend. I could still see Evan's face, crumpled and confused, as he pressed his forehead against the window, watching the chaos unfold. "Bob," Kate said softly from across the table, her eyes searching mine for reassurance, "you know we can't just sit here." I glanced out at the street, where the echoes of sirens had faded, but not disappeared, lingering in my mind like an unwelcome guest. It was one thing to be an attorney, it was another to bring the weight of that profession crashing down on our neighborhood. The thought of taking on the police felt like stepping into a ring with no clear winner, an invitation to battle against a system designed to protect them. "What about the kids?" I asked, trying to dismiss the growing knot in my stomach. "What will this do to them?" Kate shifted in her seat, her fingers intertwined tightly, as if trying to hold on to something solid in this turbulent sea. "If we don't act, how will they ever feel safe again? They need to know justice exists." A sudden gust swept up leaves from our yard and scattered them like memories blown away too quickly. Just then, Daniel stepped onto the porch, his presence shifting the air around us. His usual humor seemed muted today. He looked serious as he leaned against the railing. "I heard you're thinking about suing," he said, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Are you sure that's what you want?" The question landed heavily between us. Suing felt so final, so definitive, a choice akin to drawing a line in sand that would forever alter our landscape. I thought back to Helen's words from last night about justice being more than punishment. It was also about healing. "Bob, this isn't just about you or your family anymore. This is bigger than us." I ran my hand through my hair, feeling each strand slip through my fingers like grains of sand escaping my control. It was true. This wasn't merely about our trauma, but about all those who felt powerless under oppressive authority. Kate spoke again, her voice firmer now. "We have to stand up for what's right. If we don't take this step now, who will?" Her determination ignited something within me, a flicker of courage buried beneath layers of hesitation and doubt. But it also brought forth a wave of uncertainty. Every action had its repercussions. "Do you think it'll change anything?" I asked quietly, unsure whether I wanted an answer or if I was merely voicing my fears. Daniel shrugged slightly before looking out toward the street where shadows seemed darker than they should be, the remnants of fear left behind by sirens and brutality. "It might not change everything, but it could make people think twice before acting." At that moment, I understood what needed to be done. It wasn't just about seeking justice for ourselves, but about standing up for those who didn't have a voice. My decision crystallized, like ice forming over still water. We would move forward with this lawsuit. But even as hope began swirling within me like smoke rising from an extinguished flame, dread settled deep in my gut. The realization that once this path was chosen, there'd be no turning back. "What happens after we file?" Daniel questioned, as if sensing my internal struggle. I hesitated before answering him because part of me feared what lay ahead, public scrutiny paired with potential backlash from a community torn between loyalty and justice. "We prepare for whatever comes next," I finally said resolutely while gripping my Mont Blanc tighter, a talisman against uncertainty. In that moment of shared resolve among friends who felt more like family than mere neighbors, an unspoken understanding passed between us. We were ready to fight, not just for ourselves, but for everyone affected by injustice lurking behind badges and uniforms. Yet as I lifted my gaze toward Kate's expectant look, mingled with worry etched across her face, my heart whispered doubts louder than any words spoken aloud. Was this really the right path? Did we truly understand all the risks involved? A soft breeze rustled through nearby trees outside, filling spaces once filled only with silence, as if nature itself awaited our answer too. The door swung open, and there she stood, Helen, my daughter. Her eyes were red-rimmed, a storm cloud of emotions brewing just beneath the surface. I could see the hesitation in her stance, as if the weight of the world was pressing against her shoulders. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It felt like an echo from another time, a time when everything seemed simpler. But that simplicity had long since evaporated, leaving only the complexity of our lives tangled in the air between us. I stepped closer, wanting to bridge that gap, but she held up a hand. "I can't do this right now." The words hit me like a slap. They stung more than I expected. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about something larger, something festering under the surface of our community. "Let's talk," I urged, trying to coax her out from behind whatever wall she had built. But she shook her head, glancing nervously at the worn-out couch in the corner. "I don't know how to face it all," Helen admitted. She looked away from me, and it felt as if a shadow had crossed over her heart. The air between us thickened with unspoken fears and uncertainties. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy boots on wood floors. My gut twisted as I recognized the rhythm. It was Marcus, my old friend from law school, his presence always commanding attention. He entered without invitation, a wave crashing into our already turbulent waters. "Bob, we need to discuss the case," he boomed. His arrival brought an instant shift in energy. A spotlight turned toward me, while Helen receded into the background. I could see her jaw tightening, as if bracing for impact. "Marcus," I said cautiously, "can't this wait? Helen is—" "No," she interjected sharply, finally breaking through her own fortress of silence. "You both need to talk about it. The case matters more than anything else right now." Her determination hung in the air like an unfinished song. It was unexpected, yet liberating. Suddenly all eyes were on her, not just mine or Marcus's, but on her resolve. As Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to another, I sensed a new dynamic forming among us, a power shift that felt palpable yet precarious. He respected Helen's fire, but didn't quite know how to respond to it. "Fine," he relented after a moment's pause. "What do you think we should do then?" His tone softened slightly as he glanced between us. "I think we should take action, right now." Helen's voice was steady and clear, filled with a determination that reminded me of young activists marching for justice in years past. She was no longer just my daughter. She was becoming a force of nature. The weight of her words settled heavily around us as I considered what this meant for both my family and our cause. A million thoughts raced through my mind, strategies, risks, but each one seemed eclipsed by this new perspective emerging from my daughter. "This isn't just your fight anymore," I said slowly, feeling the swell of pride mix with concern within me. "But are you ready for what comes next?" "Yes," she asserted fiercely. There was no hesitation now. Clarity radiated off her like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. And just like that, a pivot point, we were united in purpose despite our earlier tensions. The atmosphere buzzed with possibilities, yet doubt lingered stubbornly at the edges of my mind. "Okay," I nodded slowly, while stealing glances at Marcus, who seemed caught off guard by this turn of events, but also intrigued by Helen's newfound courage. Yet even amid this surge of hope and unity, questions loomed unanswered like shadows lurking in corners. What would we face next? Would our combined strengths be enough? I couldn't shake off those uncertainties. They clung to me like damp clothes after rain. As Helen stepped forward, a soldier ready for battle, I felt an uneasy knot tighten in my stomach at how fragile this moment was. We were standing on shifting sands. Any misstep could send us tumbling down into uncertainty once more.
The morning air was unusually crisp, a biting chill that seeped into my bones as I stepped onto the porch. I could still feel the remnants of last night's events clinging to me like a heavy blanket. The sight of that homeless man being dragged away by officers, his cries echoing in the stillness, played on repeat in my mind. I walked over to the doorbell camera, my fingers brushing against its cold surface. It felt like an accusing finger pointing back at me. I had reviewed the footage countless times since Sunday, but each time I watched it, a new detail struck me harder than before. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen as if it might reveal some hidden truth. Kate joined me on the porch, her brow furrowed in concern. "Bob, are you sure we should be watching this again?" "It's not going to change what happened," she said softly, worry lacing her tone. "I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The video didn't just capture an incident. It was a window into a world of injustice I thought we were moving past. Yet here it was again, raw and unfiltered. As Kate watched the footage with me, her expression shifted from concern to disbelief. "Look at how they treat him," she murmured, eyes wide. "Is this really how we're handling things now?" Before I could respond, Daniel appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He had been out running errands, and he looked taken aback by our somber gathering. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between us and then zeroing in on the screen. I paused for a moment before answering. "Just reviewing what happened with that man," I said, trying to find words that wouldn't shatter their innocence further. Daniel raised an eyebrow and stepped closer. "You mean the guy who got taken away?" His tone shifted slightly. There was more curiosity than judgment in his voice. "Yeah," I sighed heavily and gestured toward the screen again. "We need to understand what led to that." My gut told me there was more than met the eye. A tangled web of neglect and systemic failure woven into that moment. Behind us, Megan joined in, having returned from her own corner of our chaotic household life formed. She caught wind of our conversation and approached cautiously. "Dad, you okay?" Her voice was gentle but laced with apprehension. "I'm fine," I lied instinctively. Fathers are supposed to be unbreakable pillars in times like these. But inside me churned turmoil. "Are you sure?" she pressed on as she leaned against the railing beside Kate. I took a deep breath, as if preparing for battle. My chest tightened at their worried faces, reflecting concern back at me like mirrors, showing a fractured image of myself. "We've got to think about what we do next," I said firmly, my gaze flickering back to the doorbell camera footage playing out again, a stark reminder of why we fought so hard for justice and dignity in our community. "Next?" Kate repeated incredulously. "You mean sue? Is that even possible?" I nodded slowly. Hope mingled with uncertainty inside me like oil and water, refusing to blend completely. "It is possible," I affirmed quietly. The idea sent tendrils of adrenaline racing through my veins. The thrill of fighting for justice always lit a fire within me. But just as quickly, doubt crept back in. Was this fight worth dragging them into? To bring them into this narrative where power dynamics twisted and turned like vines around our lives? I glanced at Daniel once more. He seemed deep in thought now, as he considered our next move carefully, while looking between Kate and Megan's anxious expressions. "They need to know," he finally spoke up decisively, after weighing his thoughts out loud for all of us to hear. Megan's eyes widened slightly at his words. The gravity hanging thick in the air added weight behind them. She bit her lip nervously. Every piece fell into place, yet carried immense responsibility, too heavy for any one individual alone. "But are we ready?" Kate's question hung in silence around us, like an uninvited guest at dinner, awkward yet unavoidable. The tension thickened as we stood together on that porch, the chilly morning air wrapping around us like an invisible cloak shielding our fears from prying eyes outside our bubble of worry and love. "Ready or not," I said firmly, while staring straight ahead towards nothingness beyond our yard's fence line, where life bustled unaware outside our personal strife, unfolding silently among us now. Our very own neighborhood theater screening tragedy underfoot unnoticed until it crashed through someone else's world unexpectedly.
In that instant, clarity washed over me. A resolve formed amidst chaos swirling just beneath skin. I had no choice anymore but to act, to stand firm against injustice, even if uncertain waters lay ahead waiting patiently beneath, every calculated risk taken forth from here onward into battle lines drawn across legalities, stretching infinitely far beyond mere disagreements between people. They were soul-deep clashes rooted long ago before any single incident ever occurred, worth fighting for today, despite shadows cast looming large overhead, still haunting memories left behind grief-stricken hearts, beating louder than words spoken freely among family gathered nearby, unwillingly caught up within the struggle, raging onward without end seemingly forevermore unless someone dared step forward boldly demanding change occur instead. Pushing past hesitation coiling tightly within, I made my decision. Yes, we would pursue justice together, not only for ourselves, but also for those unable to speak out against oppressive forces bearing down upon them relentlessly, to reclaim honor lost amid societal failures too long ignored, lingering painfully behind closed doors, hidden away under layers suffocating hope, desperately needing release. As we began discussing plans surrounding potential steps forward, though, uncertainty loomed larger now than before. We felt invigorated somehow, despite everything looming ominously overhead, spiraling wildly towards unknown futures, filled always with risks lurking everywhere, hiding just out of reach, awaiting moments ripe enough, waiting quietly until opportunity knocked loudly, demanding attention, drawn away from distractions, followed closely thereafter by consequences inevitably arising unexpectedly from choices made along twisted paths, leading farther apart rather than closer together, ultimately reaching clear destinations sought after heartily throughout journey traveled willingly together united, fully despite fears rising higher threatening discord among common bonds forged anew daily, forged stronger through shared experiences, weathered collectively within familial embrace, holding tight against storms battering down relentlessly, outside world beyond porch walls surrounding us now, safely cocooned, fondly shared memories formed, tightly knit overall priceless treasures, captured lovingly held dear, forever held close, eternally cherished, deeply rooted connections blossoming beautiful gardens planted, lovingly nurtured, tirelessly grown strong, unwavering, resilient, throughout trials faced courageously undeterred, bravely pushing forward, endlessly striving, evermore onward. But even while standing resolute gathered here together, it remained unclear whether outcome awaited beyond distant horizon gleaming brightly ahead, beckoning gently, promising brighter days. Would they come soon enough before encroaching darkness swallowed whole all hope's dreams, hopes fluttering gently above fragile hearts, yearning desperately lift off ground, yearning soar skyward, freeze escape shackles binding downward earthbound souls, trapped helplessly unable to break chains, holding fast, even tighter given circumstances, pressing close, pushing harder, every second passing?
The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, and I could hear my friend's laughter mingling with the distant chirping of birds. It was a sound that should have brought comfort, but today felt different. The air was heavy, thick with something unspoken. I sat there, cradling a steaming cup of coffee, its warmth barely penetrating the chill in my bones. The recent memory of that brutal scene outside my house replayed in my mind like an unwelcome song stuck on repeat. A homeless man, someone I'd seen many times before, was being dragged away by officers right under my window. I'd hoped to shield my kids from the harsh realities of the world, yet here they were, witnesses to violence. "Have you thought about what happened?" Kate's voice cut through my thoughts as she leaned forward in her chair, concern etched on her face. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her gaze like an anchor pulling me down. It shouldn't have happened like that. Not in front of them. I gestured toward the house where my children were probably still processing what they saw. "Bob," Megan interjected, her tone firm yet gentle. "You're a civil rights attorney. Isn't there something you can do?" I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, running my fingers over the HOA letters piled beside me, a reminder of minor grievances among neighbors that suddenly felt trivial. They were just words on paper, nothing compared to real life unfolding in front of our eyes. "Maybe we need to gather more information first," Sam suggested, adjusting his glasses thoughtfully. "Talk to those who were there." But as I looked at each of their faces, I felt a sharp, inciting moment, a rush of adrenaline mixed with apprehension coursing through me. This wasn't just about legalities. It was about honor and responsibility as a father and an advocate for justice. Before I could respond, Daniel spoke up with unexpected fervor. "Bob, this isn't just your fight. It affects everyone around here." His voice carried a conviction that resonated with me. "Yeah," Evan added, quietly but firmly, "we can't let this slide." A decision began to take shape within me. Perhaps it was time to act not only for my family, but for that man who had been dragged away like he was nothing more than trash on the street. My heart raced as I considered reaching out to community organizations or even local media to shed light on this incident. "What will happen if you do?" Kate asked softly, sensing the shift inside me. I took a deep breath and looked at each friend again. Their support felt tangible now, almost like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. If I chose to stand up against this injustice, would it lead to repercussions? Would it change how we all lived in this neighborhood? The immediate consequence hung heavy in the air. I could feel power shifting as hope ignited between us like sparks waiting for kindling. There were no guarantees. My family might face backlash or scrutiny, but staying silent felt like surrendering our values. As we debated our next steps and bounced ideas off one another, a soft rustle drew my attention back toward the house. The children were at the window now, looking out at us with wide eyes filled with questions neither of us knew how to answer yet. Then came a knock at the door, a single sound that made all eyes turn toward it in unison. Was it someone wanting answers, or maybe someone trying to silence us? My stomach twisted with uncertainty as I rose from my chair. Should I answer that? My voice wavered slightly. Anticipation crackled around us like static electricity before a storm. Each friend exchanged glances laced with curiosity and concern, while I stood there frozen between action and hesitation. What awaited me behind that door? The door to the conference room swung open, and there she was, Helen, my daughter. A flurry of determination radiated from her. She stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. It was a sound that hadn't heard in years, but it always meant business. She glanced at the papers strewn across the table, a chaotic landscape of testimonies and legal briefs. Without skipping a beat, Helen crossed her arms and surveyed the scene like a hawk poised to swoop down on its prey. "What is this mess?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the tension that hung in the air. I could feel my heart racing. "We're preparing for tomorrow," I replied, trying to maintain composure. But Helen's presence ignited something in me, a sense of urgency mixed with pride. She had become a strong advocate for social justice in her own right, often stepping up when I felt overwhelmed by the weight of our cases. "She don't have time to fumble through this," she said, inching closer to the table as if willing it to organize itself under her gaze. "Who's supposed to present the evidence on discrimination claims?" I rubbed my temples, feeling each pulse of anxiety resonate through me. "I thought you would be able to help." I didn't want to admit how lost I felt without her guidance. After all these years, even I could get swept away by the current of an ongoing case. She narrowed her eyes, searching for answers buried within my vague response. Just then, Mark entered the room, a junior associate who had just joined us last month. His timid demeanor clashed with Helen's energy as he shuffled in with a stack of folders barely taller than his own frame. "Sorry I'm late, the printer jammed again," he stammered, adjusting his glasses nervously while glancing between us. A wave of frustration washed over me. "You need to be more proactive than that," I said sharply before catching myself. I didn't want Helen seeing me lose control in front of someone so inexperienced.
Helen turned toward Mark with an intensity that made him shrink back slightly. "If we're going to win this case, every detail matters," she urged him gently but firmly. "What do you have for us?" Mark opened one folder and began reciting numbers about employment rates and systemic disparities. His voice trembled like leaves caught in a gusty wind, yet beneath that nervous facade lay valuable information that could turn our case around if presented right. As he spoke, I noticed how Helen leaned in closer, absorbing every word like a sponge soaking up water from dry ground. The gravity shifted. Both our attention focused on Mark instead of drifting into uncertainties dissolved into air between us. "I think," he hesitated before continuing, "there are patterns here that suggest intentional discrimination." He glanced at me briefly, before returning his gaze to Helen, as if seeking validation from someone who commanded respect. Her eyes lit up with possibilities as new ideas formed behind her brow furrowed in concentration. This was it, the breakthrough we desperately needed to build our argument against those entrenched in ignorance and prejudice. "Let's adjust our strategy then," she declared decisively, while flipping through notes scattered across the table like autumn leaves strewn by an unseen breeze. Her tone left no room for second-guessing. It was authoritative, yet filled with encouragement, a lighthouse guiding wayward ships homeward. The shift was palpable. Hope surged among us where despair once lingered like fog over a forgotten coast. We were no longer merely reacting, we were taking charge together under Helen's unwavering leadership. But just as momentum built within us like waves crashing against jagged rocks, my phone buzzed on the table, a reminder of reality intruding upon our newfound resolve. I glanced down at the screen and froze. It was a message from an old contact who warned me about potential backlash from powerful figures involved in our case, figures whose influence loomed large enough to eclipse even truth itself if they chose to strike back swiftly. "Dad," Helen's worried voice broke through my thoughts as she noticed my change in expression. "It's nothing," I lied too quickly. Uncertainty clawed at my insides like vines choking out light from within dark corners. But deep down, I knew that whatever storm awaited us might be far more dangerous than any courtroom battle we faced together tonight. But there it was, the flickering flame of determination ignited anew within me and reflected brightly off Helen's resolute gaze beside me, ready for whatever lay ahead.
The air outside was thick with tension, punctuated by the murmur of voices and the distant sound of sirens. The porch creaked beneath me as I shifted my weight, clutching the case digest tightly in my hands. It felt like a lifeline in this storm of uncertainty. I could hear laughter from down the street, children playing, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had unfolded just days before. I glanced at the clock, feeling the minutes slip away like sand through my fingers. The police were late for our meeting. Each passing second weighed heavier on me, a reminder of the night when that homeless man was dragged away. My kids had been watching, their eyes wide with fear, their innocence shattered. I could still hear their gasps echoing in my mind. When they finally arrived, 2 officers stepped onto my porch, their faces impassive. One looked young, barely out of training, while the other exuded an air of authority that felt suffocating. They nodded at me but didn't offer any words of comfort. Instead, they stood there as if waiting for me to speak first. I inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself. "Thank you for coming," I said, though it sounded more like a challenge than gratitude. The gravity of this moment pressed against my chest like a weight. "Let's get right to it," the older officer said brusquely. "We're here to discuss what you witnessed." I opened the case digest and felt its rough edges against my fingertips, a reminder of all the lives tangled in legal battles over justice and honor. "What happened on Sunday wasn't just an incident," I said firmly. "It was witnessed by children who are now terrified. Their expressions remained unchanged, as if I was talking to stone statues rather than human beings sworn to protect us. Frustration bubbled within me like boiling water threatening to spill over. "Look," I continued, keeping my voice steady despite my rising anger, "you can't deny that what happened was excessive." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, but didn't offer any defense or explanation. Only silence hung between us like a noose. Just then, Evan came out onto the porch,
his small face drawn tight with worry. He clutched a toy truck in his hand. It seemed like such a trivial thing compared to the chaos we were discussing, but it symbolized everything, the safety and innocence he deserved, but which had been threatened. "Mommy?" Evan's voice trembled as he looked up at me and then at the officers. "Go back inside," I urged gently but firmly, not wanting him to witness this confrontation any more than necessary. But before he could obey, one of the officers spoke up sharply. "We don't want kids involved in this." I turned back to them, fury igniting within me again. "You think I want this? You think I wanted him taken away in front of them?" The younger officer finally spoke up, hesitating, as if weighing his words carefully. "We understand your concern," but his tone lacked sincerity. It felt rehearsed and hollow. Then Helen entered from inside the house. Her presence brought a sudden sense of calmness to my spiraling thoughts. Dressed casually yet confidently, she stood beside me with an air of solidarity that made me feel less alone in this fight. "What do you mean, understand?" she interjected fiercely before I could respond further. Her eyes glinted with resolve as she faced them head-on. "This isn't just about understanding, it's about accountability." With her words hanging heavy in the air, something shifted. The officers exchanged glances filled with uncertainty for perhaps the first time since they'd arrived. I seized on this momentary crack in their armor and pressed forward. There are consequences for actions taken against our community members, especially those who are vulnerable. The older officer cleared his throat, as if preparing himself for something difficult but important enough to articulate clearly. "We'll review what happened." It felt like a hollow promise, an olive branch offered only after realizing they were being challenged, but it was a start nonetheless. As they prepared to leave, I caught sight of Evan peeking through the doorframe again. He needed reassurance after all that had transpired outside these walls. "Keep him safe," I whispered under my breath as they retreated down our porch steps into their squad car parked nearby, its engine humming ominously, as if readying itself for another call into dark waters where justice often drowned. After they drove off with tires screeching against asphalt like nails on chalkboard, a reminder of how quickly peace could shatter, I leaned heavily against the railing and took a deep breath, while Helen placed her hand reassuringly on mine. "We did well," she said softly but earnestly, while watching our kids play obliviously without knowing what transpired moments earlier on our porch. But uncertainty still loomed large above us. Would anything change? Would those promises made today mean anything tomorrow? As we stood there together amidst laughter spilling over from innocent childhood games, we both sensed an unsettled truth lingering just beyond reach, a chilling whisper promising that change never comes easy nor without sacrifice along its path towards honor restored. The door creaked open, letting a gust of chilly air swirl into the room. I stood there, staring at Helen, my heart pounding like a drum in a parade. She was clutching that old legal brief, its edges frayed and yellowed with time, a testament to battles fought and lost. "Bob," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we can't let them get away with this." I could see her resolve hardening like steel forged in a fire. The urgency of the moment hung thick in the air, wrapping around us like fog on a winter morning. Before I could respond, she flung the brief onto the table, papers scattering like leaves caught in a whirlwind. "We have to file an injunction today." Her eyes sparkled with determination, igniting something deep within me. "But it's risky," I cautioned. "What if they retaliate?" The last thing I wanted to do was put her in harm's way. My mind raced with memories of past cases. We had faced harsh opposition before. Helen stepped closer, her stance firm. "If we don't act now, all those families will suffer." She looked straight into my eyes, allowing no room for doubt or hesitation. In that moment, I realized how much this meant to her, not just as an attorney, but as someone who genuinely cared about justice. Just then, the door swung open again, and Tom walked in, his face flush and breathless. "I heard what they're planning," he panted, leaning against the wall for support. "They're going to bulldoze the community center next week." My stomach twisted at the thought of losing that place, where kids laughed freely and neighbors came together. It wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was hope etched into every corner. Helen turned to Tom sharply. "Do you have proof?" He nodded vigorously, pulling out a folder from under his arm. "Everything's here, emails from city officials and plans for demolition." His voice dropped to a whisper as he handed it over like it was fragile glass. I took a deep breath and felt a weight lift from my shoulders as Helen flipped through the documents. There it was, a roadmap of their intentions laid bare before us. "Bob," she said suddenly, looking up with fierce determination etched across her features, "we need to file that injunction now." The power shifted palpably in the room. Suddenly we weren't just two attorneys anymore. We were warriors preparing for battle against an injustice that threatened our community. I nodded slowly, but couldn't shake off my lingering doubts about the repercussions we might face. But then I saw Helen's unwavering gaze, and it ignited something within me too. With renewed purpose coursing through my veins, I reached for my laptop on the desk. Let's draft that injunction. My fingers flew over the keys as adrenaline surged through me like electricity dancing down power lines during a storm. Just then, my phone buzzed violently on the table, a harsh reminder that life outside our makeshift war room continued unabated. I glanced down at the screen. It was an unknown number calling me again and again, the same one from earlier in the week when ominous threats had started rolling in. My heart sank as unease washed over me once more like waves crashing against jagged rocks. Helen noticed my change in demeanor instantly. "What is it?" she asked softly but firmly, her hand resting reassuringly on mine. "I don't know who this is," I replied cautiously, while glancing back at Tom, who raised an eyebrow knowingly. He understood all too well how things could escalate beyond our control. The phone kept buzzing relentlessly, as if taunting me with unresolved questions hovering just out of reach, just like justice sometimes felt, elusive yet ever present on the horizon of our fight ahead. The porch creaked beneath my weight as I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. The air felt thick around me, heavy with the scent of damp wood from last night's rain. My fingers trembled slightly as they grazed the rough surface of the fake invoice I had printed out just hours before. That incident with the police had shaken me to my core. I could still hear the shouts of the officers and the terrified cries of children in my neighborhood. It was a cacophony that replayed in my mind like a haunting melody, one that refused to fade away. I had always believed in justice, but standing there, watching that helpless man being dragged away made me question everything. Kate joined me on the porch, her expression a mix of concern and frustration. "Bob, we need to do something about this." Her voice broke through my thoughts like a sudden clap of thunder. She was right. Action was necessary. But how? Did we really want to take on the police department? I unfolded the fake invoice slowly, feeling its paper texture under my fingertips, each crease representing layers of deceit. I hadn't intended for it to be an actual weapon, but it felt like one now. A means to expose a truth hidden behind badges and uniforms. Kate leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as they scanned over the document. "What's this?" she asked, suspicion lacing her tone. "This," I replied softly, "is a piece of evidence." Before I could explain further, Evan stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. He looked from me to Kate and back again, sensing the tension hanging in the air like thick fog. "You two look serious," he remarked lightly, though his eyes darted toward the invoice. "Serious is putting it mildly," I said sharply. "What happened last weekend? That can't just be swept under the rug." Evan took a sip from his mug and frowned. "You mean with that guy? What are you planning?" I hesitated. His casual demeanor masked an urgency that simmered beneath his surface. But then again, maybe he didn't fully grasp what we were facing, a fractured system that glorified authority while trampling over those who needed protection most. "He needs representation," Kate interjected firmly. "If we don't stand up for him, who will?" Her words ignited something inside me, an ember turning into a flame. I glanced at Evan again, seeing determination flicker across his face, as if he finally understood what was at stake here. Honor, not only for us or our community, but for all those silenced by fear. "All right," I said finally, making a decision that would shift everything around us. "Let's gather more evidence first, before we approach anyone else." Evan nodded slowly, while Kate's brows furrowed deeper in concentration. The power dynamic shifted. It felt as if we were standing on a precipice now, ready to leap into uncharted territory. As we began discussing our next steps, Megan appeared at the top of the stairs leading down from our house. She had obviously overheard us talking. Curiosity sparkled in her eyes. "What are you guys plotting?" she asked, innocently, yet with an edge of seriousness that belied her youth. I exchanged glances with Kate and Evan. This was no longer just about adults making decisions behind closed doors. It involved everyone now. "Megan," I began, carefully, choosing my words with intent as I reached out for her hand in reassurance. "We're trying to help someone who needs it very badly." She stepped forward cautiously, but eagerly listened as we explained what had happened last Sunday, the violence witnessed by children who should have been playing instead of witnessing brutality unfold right before their eyes. When I finished speaking, silence enveloped us like a heavy blanket, until Megan finally spoke up, her voice steady, despite her age. "So, are you going to sue them?" Her question hung there like an unresolved chord waiting for resolution. It carried weight far beyond its simplicity. I took a deep breath and nodded slowly, while exchanging another glance with Kate and Evan. We all shared that same understanding now, the kind forged through collective resolve, mingled with fear and courage alike. "We're going to try," I affirmed quietly. But even as those words left my lips, doubt curled its way back into my mind. What if this effort ended up doing more harm than good? What if we couldn't make any headway against such entrenched authority? The idea gnawed at me like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. But then again, what choice did we have? To remain silent was not an option anymore, not with kids depending on us to show them that justice mattered, even when systems failed them time after time again. Just then, Daniel walked up onto our porch, wearing his usual bright smile, a stark contrast to our grim discussion moments earlier. But something about his expression changed when he noticed our somber mood. "What's going on?" he asked casually, but stopped short when he spotted the fake invoice lying between us like an open wound exposed under harsh light. I could feel tension coiling tighter around us, the stakes rising higher than any of us anticipated, and yet uncertainty lingered heavily within me still. Would this lead us down a path where no resolution lay ahead? "It's complicated," Kate replied evasively, while shifting her weight from one foot to another, an unconscious gesture revealing anxiety even amidst bravado. Before Daniel could press further for details or offer suggestions towards solutions we might pursue together, I caught sight of something lurking near our driveway. Two uniformed officers leaning against their squad car parked outside, as if waiting patiently for something or someone to emerge from within these walls once more. My heart raced anew, as questions rushed through my mind. Had they come here expecting trouble? Was there danger looming just beyond this momentary reprieve? None of us dared speak aloud what hovered between us. The possibility that confronting those officers directly might escalate tensions further than any of us intended. So instead, we remained silent, cloaked again by uncertainty, while pondering whether pursuing justice meant stepping into unknown waters riddled with perilous currents ahead. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the judge tapped his gavel, eyes darting between the two sides. It was a sharp reminder that this was more than just a case. It was a matter of principle, of justice. As I shifted nervously, Helen, my assistant, leaned closer to me. "Bob, we can't let them get away with this," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around us. Her determination sparked something inside me. But then came the unexpected moment. A young woman in the back row stood up, her hands trembling. I recognized her as one of our key witnesses, someone who had been afraid to speak out until now. "I have something to say," she called out, her voice breaking through the murmurs. The judge frowned, but gestured for her to continue. My stomach twisted as I realized we might be on the verge of a breakthrough or total collapse. This was a gamble, not just for us, but for everyone who had suffered under the weight of discrimination. Helen exchanged glances with me, her eyes brightening with hope. "Let her speak," I finally said, feeling the weight of authority settle on my shoulders. This could change everything. As the witness approached the stand, an air of expectancy enveloped the room like a shroud. She took a deep breath and began recounting her story, each word punctuated by raw emotion and undeniable truth. The impact was palpable. My heart raced with every revelation. The opposing counsel fidgeted in his seat, clearly rattled by this unexpected turn of events. I felt a surge of power rising within me as I watched him squirm under the pressure of our witness's words. Yet, even as victory loomed on the horizon, doubt crept in like shadows at dusk. What if they found some way to discredit her? What if this moment slipped through our fingers like sand? Bob, Helen's voice nudged me back from my swirling thoughts. We need to prepare for their next move. Her tone grounded me as we both understood that any moment could shift again. This battle is far from over.
The porch creaked beneath me as I leaned against the railing, watching the sun dip low behind the hills. The muted sounds of laughter from kids playing in the yard mingled with the distant hum of the neighborhood. Yet all I could think about was the violence I had witnessed just days before. A homeless man, a familiar face to many, had been dragged away by officers in front of my house, his cries muffled under their shouts. The kids had stood at the window, eyes wide with fear and confusion. My heart ached for them. This wasn't just another incident. It was a violation of our very humanity, played out on our doorstep. I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of that moment pressing down on me like an iron cufflink. The image replayed in my mind. His scuffed shoes, the way he clutched his belongings to his chest as if they were lifelines. I knew that I couldn't let this go unnoticed, not after what those children had seen. Just then, Kate stepped out onto the porch, her brow furrowed with concern. "Have you thought about what we should do?" she asked softly, breaking through my thoughts. Her voice was steady but laced with uncertainty. "I can't just sit back and let this happen," I replied, feeling a surge of resolve wash over me. "We have to stand up for him, for us." Kate nodded, but hesitated. What if they come after us? What if it makes things worse? The worry in her eyes was palpable. "You mean worse than it already is? We can't allow fear to dictate our actions." My jaw tightened as I contemplated the risks involved, but standing idly felt like surrendering to injustice. Before I could say more, Megan called from inside, her voice ringing clear as day. "Dad, can we go back outside now?" It cut through my turmoil like a knife, reminding me that our children's innocence hung in the balance. "Just a minute," I shouted back before turning to Kate again. "I'm doing this for them." She sighed deeply, weighing my words carefully. "Okay, if you're sure." Her voice trailed off into silence. As if summoned by fate itself, Evan appeared at the foot of the porch steps. He'd always had a knack for sensing when tension brewed in our home. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between Kate and me. "We're talking about what happened last weekend," I said slowly, gauging his reaction. His expression shifted from curiosity to alarm in an instant. "You mean that guy? The one who—" His voice dropped as he continued cautiously, "got taken away?" "Yes," I confirmed quietly but firmly. "And we need to do something about it." Evan looked down at his feet for a moment before meeting my gaze again with determination burning bright in his eyes. "I don't want it to happen again either." Suddenly, Daniel came rushing out too, a whirlwind of energy and youthful confidence, his presence electric against the backdrop of our somber conversation. "Are we going to fight those cops? Because they don't scare me." "Not exactly fighting," I replied carefully, trying to rein in Daniel's enthusiasm while not quashing his spirit entirely. "But we need to hold them accountable." With each passing moment, every voice added layers of complexity to my decision-making process. Their innocent opinions became threads weaving into my own sense of justice and moral obligation. "Let's talk about how we can approach this," Kate suggested slowly, while glancing at Evan and Daniel with a hint of admiration mixed with worry, their eagerness both inspiring and daunting.
I took a deep breath and considered all perspectives swirling around us like leaves caught in an autumn breeze. Then realization struck me like thunder bolting through a clear sky. We needed witnesses, people who understood what happened beyond just our family's view. Maybe we should gather statements from others who saw it too, I proposed suddenly, an idea taking root within me as if lighting a fuse waiting for ignition. Kate raised her eyebrow thoughtfully, while Daniel bounced on his heels excitedly as Evan crossed his arms defiantly against any naysaying vibes lingering nearby. That could work, Evan finally declared with newfound vigor. It felt as though something had shifted within our small assembly. We were no longer just passive observers, we were becoming active participants in this pursuit for truth and justice. But then reality crashed down again like a wave threatening to pull us under. What if no one wanted to speak up? What if they feared repercussions even more than we did? Who would trust us enough to speak? Kate murmured almost inaudibly. It was less a question than an acknowledgement of vulnerability hanging heavy in the air between us all. As silence enveloped us once more like fog rolling over hillsides at dawn, something stirred deep inside me, a growing sense of responsibility igniting within me, fueled by anger over that man's mistreatment right before our eyes. He deserved better. We all did. This isn't only about him anymore, I said firmly, yet gently, as if coaxing forth courage buried beneath doubt-laden spirits all around me. My family needed reassurance now more than ever before, facing an uphill battle against systemic issues embedded within society itself. In that moment, surrounded by loved ones whose hearts echoed mine resolutely pounding together toward change rather than despair, I knew one thing above all else. Taking action meant stepping beyond comfort zones into uncharted territory, where voices would rise up collectively, transforming pain into purpose, woven tightly together through shared experiences, while holding hope steadfastly close, all bonded by resilience forged during difficult times, turned triumphs waiting patiently, still yearning ultimately toward justice prevailing eventually. The door swung open with a creak that echoed through the small office, pulling my attention away from the stack of case files on my desk. I looked up to see Helen standing there, her brow furrowed and hands clasped tightly in front of her. The tension was palpable. It felt like the air was charged with static electricity. "What's going on?" I asked, concerned by the urgency in her expression. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her as if she was sealing off the outside world. "Bob, we have a problem. The judge is leaning toward dismissing our case against the city for discrimination," she said with her voice trembling slightly. I could see frustration boiling beneath her calm facade. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my thinning hair. "What? We can't let that happen." I stood up abruptly, my heart racing. This wasn't just another case, it was a fight for justice that had consumed us both for months. Helen took a deep breath and steadied herself. "I spoke with one of the clerks in chambers. She mentioned something about new evidence being required, something we don't have." My mind raced as I processed this information. New evidence? It felt like trying to catch smoke with bare hands, impossible and frustratingly elusive. But then I remembered something, a witness who had been hesitant to come forward. "Did you reach out to Maria?" I asked, hopeful yet anxious. She nodded slowly, and I could see doubt flicker across her face. "I did, but she's scared to testify," she replied, biting her lip. "We need someone brave enough to stand up against them." A spark ignited in me at that moment. If Maria wouldn't do it, perhaps we could find someone else who would be willing to risk everything for their truth. "Let's meet with community leaders tomorrow," I suggested, feeling a surge of determination. "Are you sure?" Helen hesitated, glancing down at the floor as if searching for an answer hidden in the carpet fibers. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We can't lose hope now." My words hung in the air between us like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. Helen straightened and met my gaze with newfound resolve. "Okay, let's do it," she said firmly. In that moment, the weight shifted. It felt like we were standing on solid ground again instead of teetering on the edge of despair. Together, we had reignited our mission. But even as we plotted our next move, a nagging worry gnawed at me. What if Maria's fear kept us from finding anyone willing to speak out?